So, Jeffrey, welcome to the call and thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Nancy.
God can feel elusive to some of us, but why do you think so many believers experience what feels like silence from God?
It's interesting. I have an assignment that I do in one of my classes where my students can talk about lament psalms and maybe why the church doesn't use them as much as perhaps we ought to, or they can actually write a lament themselves. And it is just amazing. This is a generation that is so comfortable with being vulnerable in written form, whether it's a text or a post. I mean, they share their whole lives seemingly on the internet. And so they're really willing to open up. And some of the laments that they write are just amazing. And when they're lamenting, what they're lamenting about is wanting to feel the presence of God, but
Wow.
not feeling the presence of God. And so they sometimes will use the metaphor of it's like I'm praying, but my prayers are hitting the ceiling and bouncing back, and there just doesn't seem to be an answer. And I confess I have to sympathize with them because it's some people just seem to feel God's presence like sunshine on a summer day, and that's not always been my experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going anywhere. I believe, what I believe. Where, as Peter would say, where else am I going to go?
Yeah.
But it is hard sometimes to experience or to feel that presence of God.
Yeah. And so many of us, go day by day and we want to feel God's walking with us and talking to us, but that does feel a little distant, right? A little distant. So how can someone keep seeking when they feel spiritually dry or abandoned by God?
You know, one of the things that really was the genesis for this book was, how do you deal with a God who is omnipresent and yet you feel like you have to seek God? I mean, it's such a paradox. And the scholarly side of me said, all right, we're going to have to wrestle this one down to the ground. So what I did was to try to figure out, why does the Bible have this motif of God's elusiveness? And truthfully, what I came up with was the idea that this is not a bug, it's a feature. That, it's part of understanding properly who God is seeking after God. And, I'll just use one example. There's this wonderful place in the Old Testament where David, he's sitting there in his wonderful palace. He looks over and he says, "Wait a minute, God's living in a tent. That's not right." And so he goes to his prophet Nathan and he says, I want to make a house for God. Well, Nathan's a good yes man. And so he says, sure, you're the king, do what you want. But God comes to Nathan in a dream that night and says, wait a minute, who do you think you are? You don't build houses for me. I build houses for you.
Yeah.
And there's an element of danger that's lurking for Israel that as long as God was in the tabernacle, God couldn't be pinned down. He was able to move. He could just move his presence wherever he wanted to, and Israel had to follow. As soon as they got him into a house, they felt like they had God domesticated.
Hmm.
And once you've got him tied down, it creates a false sense of who God is. And I think that's kind of illustrative of the larger issue is that when we don't have to seek for God, it gives us a false sense of who God is.
Well, I know that there's a lot of people out there that are suffering, and you have chapters in your book now. Everyone, Jeffrey, he wrote this book, "Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God: Embracing Hope in Seasons of Darkness." And we all have these seasons of darkness. I know that I do, and some of the chapters that he has in his book kind of really have caught my eye. And one of them is, as he is talking about God in silence, but also seeking God in doubt. You know what? I have my doubts sometimes, I have to admit it. I don't want to, but I do. And I know there's people out there that have their doubts as well. Like, what is God even hearing me? Is he even with me? Is he walking with me? What's he doing in my life? Can you address that for someone right now?
You know, the tough part about doubt is that truthfully there are two different kinds of doubts that we can experience. One is the sort of doubt where we're doubting God's greatness. And you might think of somebody like Sarah when, she looks and she says, there's no way. I'm too old. I'm postmenopausal. There is no way that I am going to be able to have kids. So what she's doubting there is just whether God can do what God said he would do.
Hmm.
That's not the hard kind of doubt, though. I hardly know anybody that wrestles with that kind of doubt. What we struggle with is when we wrestle with God's goodness.
Hmm.
And that's where we believe to our core that God has the power to do something. What we're struggling with is why God isn't doing what he's able to do. And
Hmm.
I think that's what the psalmists are struggling with so often. They're not saying, oh God, if only you were powerful enough to do whatever. What they're
Hmm.
saying is, God, I know that you're powerful enough. So why aren't you doing what you could? I mean, that's what Psalm 22 says. In you, our
Hmm.
ancestors trusted, in you, they trusted, and you delivered them.
Hmm.
But what's hanging out there is, but you're not delivering me. That's the
Hmm.
struggle, is when we're wrestling with God's goodness.
What does it really mean to wrestle with God in faith?
Well, if we think about just that idea of doubt, the person who experienced probably the greatest crisis of doubt of any person who's ever lived was Jesus in the garden. I mean, he's there in the garden, and what he's wrestling with is God's goodness, not his greatness. He says, all things are possible for you. So
Hmm.
he's admitting right up front, God, you could do whatever you wanted. You could do this a different way if you wanted to. And he
Hmm.
says, remove this cup from me. But God doesn't remove the cup. And if we're
Hmm.
in Mark, he goes all the way to the cross. The only thing he says is, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Hmm.
But I think there's something there in the way that Jesus wrestles with his doubts.
Hmm.
He had the opportunity to walk away. The disciples are asleep. If you go to the spot where the traditional Garden of Gethsemane is, he just has to walk over the hill. I mean, it's a 10-minute walk, and he would never be heard from again. But that's not what he does. Even though he doesn't understand, even though he doesn't have everything solved, he says, I'm going to keep pressing on. And
Hmm.
so I think the way through doubt is through doubt, not around
Hmm.
doubt.
Hmm.
We don't have to solve all the issues to be able to hang on in
Hmm.
faith, even when we don't understand.
Hmm. Hmm. The wrestling with God is so prominent in our lives because we always want our own way, right? Our flesh takes over. We want our way. God, can't you give me what I'm asking you for? Why are you doing this to me right now? Can you speak into someone's life right now that's kind of struggling with that? Like, ah, I got to do what I want, but what is it really that we do need to do?
Well, what's interesting is that it seems like so often in the Bible, when people get what they want, it's terrible for them. That it's, one of the books I love the most is the book of Hosea. Hosea is written to a group of people that are in the thick of some of the most prosperous times that Israel ever had.
Hmm.
The empires that are to the east and the west, they're in decline. And so Israel's got this little window when they're able to do well, and it is absolute poison for them.
Hmm.
Amos gets onto them for abusing the poor in the middle of their prosperity. Hosea gets onto them for attributing their prosperity to the wrong source. I mean, they're thinking that Baal gave it to them. Today we would say, it's my own intelligence and stuff like that, my own hard work that gave me all of my prosperity.
Hmm.
It, Sometimes what we want is not what we need. And
Hmm.
there's the most fascinating verse in Hosea where God says, I'm going to strip all of that stuff away. I'm going to take you back to the wilderness, and we'll be able to rekindle our love in the wilderness. That's honestly, I mean, the cast of characters in the Bible that have to have their wilderness times, it goes on endlessly. Whether it's
Yes.
Abraham, Moses, Elijah, Jesus, even Paul says that he
Yeah.
spent time in Arabia before he actually got his ministry going.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's when we don't get what we want that we thrive better spiritually. As a person who just doesn't often feel God's presence so, vibrantly and I don't even know the right word to use. If I'm basing my relationship on God with just my emotions, I'm going to be in real trouble. And so what I have to figure out is a way to press on, even when I don't necessarily feel like pressing on.
Mm,
And I think, truthfully, I think Jesus is sympathetic to us in that regard.
mhm,
When you think about the encounter that Thomas has with Jesus after the resurrection, where
mhm,
first he's, oh, I'm not going to believe it unless I can put my finger in the holes and my hand in his side. And when he finally does see the risen Jesus, of course he's not about to do either of those things. But
mhm,
Jesus says something to him in there. He says, blessed are you because you've seen these things. How much more blessed are those people who are going to believe when they don't get to see those things? Well,
mhm,
he's talking about us,
mm,
that we're people who, we may love God and we may follow God, but we haven't been confronted with the risen Christ standing in front of us, holding out his hands and his side to us.
mhm,
Jesus is being sympathetic to us
mhm,
there and saying, look, I get it. It's going to be hard for you because you're going to have to believe without seeing.
mhm,
And I think there's a lesson in there that
mhm,
sometimes we're not going to fully understand, and we have to
mhm.
figure out ways to trust God even when we don't understand.
Yeah.
One of the things I, kind of, it felt like I kept coming back to every time in one chapter after another was this idea of figuring out a way to kind of reframe our minds so that we're looking at life through a theological lens. And so, if you just used a simple example like nature, I mean, some of my most vivid experiences with God have been things like sitting on Snow Creek Falls at Yosemite and seeing sunset on Half Dome. It's not letting yourself think, oh, well, look at the way that light refracts through the elements that are in our atmosphere, but
Mhm,
instead saying, this is God who
mhm.
is, putting his signature on this glorious mountain that's there.
Yeah.
It's what we do with Thanksgiving, truthfully.
Mhm,
It's where we say, okay, this is not just the bounty of my labor, this is the bounty of God's blessing. And
mhm,
so it's on a daily basis trying to take things that could just seem like natural, ordinary things and reframing them through a divine lens so that it kind of, gets us back into the current that will carry us back towards God.
mhm. You have such an amazing calming voice. Now I mean, there's going to be somebody out there that's listening to you right now. Maybe they're going through some anxiety. Can you speak into their life a little bit about that?
Well, the the flip side of having to seek for God is the constant refrain in Scripture that God is never far from us. They truthfully, the biblical authors, they kind of use that idea in two different ways. On the one hand, they say, do not fool yourself into thinking that you're something you're getting away with because God doesn't see. God sees everything. But the other side of that is, where can I go from your presence? God, you're with me all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we take those moments, kind of reframe them theologically, turn them into something that is a divine encounter, even in a sunset or a rainbow or a good steak or something like that that we have, it's a way of reminding ourselves we are never far from God's presence. He's always there for us. He says, "I'll never leave you or forsake you." That doesn't mean that we won't not understand or go through. I mean, frankly, the death rate on a long enough timeline is 100%. Every one of us is going to die. We're all going to walk through that valley of the shadow of death, but it doesn't mean that God isn't with us along the way.
For the person watching right now who feels like giving up, what could you say to them?
So I guess I would come at it in a couple of different ways. One of the things that, one of the chapters that I've got is talking about seeking after God in worship.
Mhm,
I mean, that seems so obvious that, obviously that would be a place to seek after God. But my discussion of worship kind of goes in a different direction. I have to confess, I'm just a low church Protestant. My favorite kind of worship is, I mean, I would be quite at home in, Westminster Abbey and, with the wonderful choirs and the liturgy and so forth. But it's not what I grew up with. Our,
mhm,
our church, we would have said that we had eschewed ritual altogether, even
mhm,
though it wasn't true. You could look at our bulletins from week to week and it was as consistent as the Latin Rite in there.
mhm,
But we kind of felt uncomfortable with ritual because we thought it was deadening and it might separate you from God.
Mm,
I actually think that it can work the other direction, that
mhm,
ritual can become habit, which becomes a lifestyle.
mm,
If you make a commitment, it doesn't matter if I feel like it or not, I am going to be with a worshiping community every week.
mhm,
It doesn't matter if I feel like it or not, I'm going to say the blessing every time I sit down to eat. It doesn't matter if I feel like it or not, I'm going to pray for my kids every night
mhm,
before I go to bed. Those kinds of things become habits of the heart that can keep you moving even when you don't really feel like moving. So
mm,
for that person who's struggling, one of the things they can do is they can create little habits that I don't think I said it in the book, but I've said it to my students before. They become kind of the Jillian Michaels of the spiritual world. They're there
mm,
fussing at you and telling you to keep going even when you
mhm,
don't feel like it. The other way I would come at it is to make sure that we realize we're not the only person in this relationship. And I know it seems so strange,
mm,
but our relationship with God is not just our relationship with God. There are a lot of people who are looking to us and depending on us, and the decisions that we make in our walk with God, it will affect other people.
mm,
Jesus, he constantly talks to the disciples, especially in John, about how, a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And he talks about how it would be better for a millstone to be put around the neck of this person and have them be thrown into the sea than to scandalize the faith of a little one. In both of those comments, he's saying that as a shepherd or just as a person who's, interacting with other people, we can hurt other people's faith. One of the ideas behind just pushing on when you don't feel like it is if you give up, if you decide, I've had it, I just can't take it anymore, you're going to take other people with you.
mm,
That you will be robbing other people of their chance to ever have a relationship with God because they're going to look to you and
mm,
say, well, if Jeff doesn't believe, if Jeff walked away, then I don't really think that this is real. Maybe I'll just walk away too.
mm,
So, sometimes you have to keep pressing on for the
mm,
sake of other people around you. I mean, truthfully, we do that in other areas. We
mhm,
we work jobs that sometimes are difficult and hard so that we can provide for our families.
mhm,
We sometimes we endure things that we don't want to endure for the sake of other people around us. I think there's a spiritual aspect to that as well.
mhm. Boy, you are speaking not only to someone out there's life, but you're speaking into mine. Because I know that a lot of times when I'm doing something, I always look at like I want to exit this. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. But you're right. When you do something like that, you're not just exiting for you. You're exiting away from other people's lives that you could bless or influence. And so you are so right. And thank you for pouring into someone's life right now that needed to hear that besides me. So, you have written this book, and I want to ask you a question before we come to the end part of this interview. But, why did you write this book? Why?
That's a hard answer because if you take a look at the book, I start off with talking about the passing of a dear friend of mine. It was that terrible summer when we were all, locked down with COVID, and we were having our department meetings for where I teach at Samford via Zoom. And so our department chair, he just mentioned, a friend of mine named Jim, and he was one of our colleagues, and said, pray for him. He's having a health issue. And Jim had had a heart attack before, and so we thought maybe that was the issue again. But over the course of our meetings, the tone of our chair just got more and more grave. So finally, I texted Jim and I said, "Hey, I don't know what's going on, but if you want to talk, just I'd love to." And so we just almost immediately called one another. He was one of the most eloquent people I've ever met. And from the first words that he spoke in the call, you just knew something was terribly wrong. He couldn't find his words. He kept repeating himself. He was trying to come up with the name of a town in Alabama here called Huntsville, where all of the rockets are made, but he couldn't come up with the name. He kept saying, it's the place, it's the place, it's the place, it's the place where they have the rockets.
Mm,
And it was so obvious something was going on. When I hung up, I just wept because
mm,
I'm thinking, what is my friend who, he was a preacher, he was a teacher, the words were his gift. What was he going to do when the power of speech was taken from him?
mhm,
And the trouble is, it got worse than that. They figured out that he had a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease,
mm,
which is this strange thing that where a protein goes, haywire in your brain and just starts to eat your brain, basically.
mm.
And when I had to look it up, I'd heard of the name before, but I didn't really know what it was. And so I look it up. I'm there on Wikipedia, and my eye caught where it said prognosis universally fatal.
Oh,
God had never healed someone from this before. It seemed incredibly unlikely that he was going to do it now, and he didn't. Within the matter of months, Jim died. And the
mm.
worst part of all of this was that I was teaching a class, my upper level at Samford, on Psalms and Job. And we were walking right through the book of Job at the same time that my colleague and their professor and mentor was sentenced to die. And that really was the part, the kind of impetus, the spark that said, Jeff, you're going to have to work through this. And so it began there, and the following summer, I teach a Sunday school class at a local church, and they kind of walked with me through this. Is one of the guy that I work with there. He said, why don't you do something on God's presence or encounters with God? And I was like, okay, I can do that. And I'm coming up with Moses at the burning bush or Elijah and so forth. And it dawned on me, this doesn't do any good because they're not going to get a second burning bush. They're not going to have a, still small voice in the wilderness like Elijah did. I can't replicate those experiences. So, what does it mean to wrestle with an elusive God, to seek that elusive God for people in our day and age when we go through such suffering? That's where it started, and the book is the result of that.
Well, this is wonderful. Now, um, I just want to ask people right now, and I just want to ask the audience, what if God's silence isn't absence, but an invitation to go deeper? And you can learn more about Jeffrey. Jeffrey, where is your website? Where's it located? And
So they can go to biblicalexplorations.com. I lead trips to Israel and Rome, and I've got one, that I'm starting to map out for Greece. So biblicalexplorations.com, and they'll find all of my contact information there, and they can also find it on Samford's website at samford.edu.
wonderful. And what would you like to leave my audience with today?
Well, I think one of the things that is was most meaningful for me in terms of producing the book was figuring out that all of the same ways that we seek after God are ways that Jesus himself had to seek after God. And so Jesus suffered. Jesus had to go through his time in the wilderness. Jesus had to, wrestle with doubt. He had to go through death ultimately. And, I also have a chapter on joy. Jesus was willing to experience moments of joy, so much so that some people called him a drunkard because he was willing to feast with those who needed him. When we seek after God, we're following in the footsteps of Jesus himself, who wrestled with an elusive God and ultimately paved the way for us to know through the resurrection that we'll find that God one day, even if all the way until the moment of our death, like Jesus, it's a struggle.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And for more Christ-centered conversations, go to the website, thecallwithnancysabato.com. Until next time, all glory and honor to King Jesus.